Racist officers extort money from an elderly black man, unaware his son is the city's new police captain. Walter Harris had always believed in hard work, honesty, and keeping his head down. At 70 years old, he had spent more than half his life fixing cars in the same dusty auto shop on the south side of town. It was honest work, and over the years, he had built a reputation for fairness. People respected him, not just because he knew how to fix an engine, but because he was a man who never took shortcuts, never cheated anyone, and always gave a firm handshake and a straight answer. Now retired, Walter spent his mornings the same way, sitting on the creaky wooden chair on his porch, sipping coffee from a dented thermos he had owned for years, and watching the sun rise over the city skyline. His neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was home. He had watched families grow, kids turn into adults, and businesses come and go. And despite everything, he never left. His son, Daniel Harris, had left, though. Walter had raised him alone after his wife passed away, teaching him discipline, respect, and the importance of standing up for what was right. Daniel had taken those lessons and turned them into something bigger. He had become a cop. Not just any cop, but a man determined to fix a broken system. Walter had never been prouder. But on this particular Monday, as Walter stepped out of the bank with a few $100s in his coat pocket, he had no idea that he was about to become another victim of the very system his son was trying to fix. Walter walked at a slow, steady pace, gripping his cane in one hand and his wallet in the other. He didn't trust banks to hold all his money, didn't believe in credit cards or online banking. He lived by a simple rule. If I can't hold it, I don't trust it. So every first Monday of the month, he withdrew just enough to cover his bills, buy some groceries, and keep a little extra in his coat for emergencies. As he made his way down the sidewalk, the streets were unusually quiet. A cold wind cut through the air, making him pull his collar up against his neck. He was just a few blocks from home when a black and white police cruiser slowed beside him. Walter's grip on his cane tightened. He had lived long enough to know trouble when he saw it. The squad car rolled to a stop, and two officers stepped out. Officer Randall Green, tall and thick-necked, adjusted his belt as he stepped forward, a smirk already on his face. Officer David Myers, leaner and sharp-featured, stayed back, his eyes scanning Walter like a predator sizing up its next meal. Walter knew their names. Everyone in the neighborhood knew their names. Green spoke first, his voice carrying an air of forced authority. "Where are you coming from, old man?" Walter met his gaze, but kept his voice calm. "Just the bank, officers. Is there a problem?" Myers took a slow step forward, smirking. "Maybe. We've been getting reports of counterfeit bills floating around. You wouldn't happen to have any funny money on you, would you?" Walter frowned, his stomach tightening. He knew exactly where this was going. "I don't know anything about that," Walter said evenly. Green took another step closer, looming over him. "That so? Well, how about you let us take a look at what's in your pockets? Just to be sure." Walter's instincts screamed at him to walk away, but he knew better. Black men who walked away from cops didn't always make it home. "I just took out my own money," Walter said, his voice steady. "You don't have any reason to—" Before he could finish, Green grabbed his coat, yanking it open. Walter stumbled back, his bad knee buckling slightly. "Let's see what we got," Green muttered, reaching inside Walter's coat and pulling out the wad of bills. He fanned through them with exaggerated suspicion, then shook his head. "Looks mighty suspicious to me." Myers leaned in, grinning. "Yeah, definitely looks like counterfeit. Could be a serious charge." Walter felt his chest tighten. "That money is mine." Myers ignored him. "Unless," he said, voice dripping with false sympathy, "unless you want to make this go away." Walter clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists. This was a shakedown. He had heard the stories before. People stopped by these two officers, harassed, forced to hand over cash just to be left alone. He never thought it would happen to him. Green smirked. "Come on, old man. Hand over the rest of it, and maybe we forget we saw anything." Walter's heart pounded. He had spent his entire life following the law, raising his son to believe in justice, and here he was, being robbed by the very people meant to uphold it. His fingers trembled as he reached into his wallet and pulled out the remaining cash. It wasn't just money. It was his dignity. Green snatched the bills, folded them neatly, and stuffed them into his pocket. "See? That wasn't so hard." Walter said nothing. He just stared at them, memorizing their faces, their smirks, the way Myers adjusted his badge like it made him untouchable. The officers climbed back into their cruiser, laughing to themselves as they sped off, leaving Walter standing in the cold, fists clenched, his cane digging into the pavement. They had taken everything from him, or so they thought, because what they didn't know, what neither of them could have imagined, was that they had just stolen from the wrong man's father. That evening, Walter sat in his dimly lit living room staring at his hands. His son had become a cop to stop men like them. He never wanted to burden Daniel with his problems. He never wanted his son to think he couldn't handle himself. But this time, he had to call. He reached for the phone and dialed. When Daniel answered, his voice was warm but alert. "Dad, you okay?" Walter hesitated. Then, in a voice that was steady but lined with quiet fury, he said, "Son, I need you to listen to me. 2 officers just robbed me." Silence. Then, Daniel's voice, colder than Walter had ever heard it. "Who?" Walter exhaled. "Randall Green and David Myers." Another pause. Then, Daniel spoke again. His voice wasn't just angry. It was deadly. "I'll handle it." Walter had never heard his son speak that way before. He didn't have to ask what Daniel meant. Because when the newly appointed police captain said he would handle something, he meant it. And right now, 2 dirty cops had no idea their time was running out. Daniel Harris sat in his office, his fingers drumming against the mahogany desk as he reviewed reports from his first month as the city's new police captain. He had worked for years to earn this position, climbing the ranks, fighting corruption from the inside, and proving to the community that there were still good officers willing to do the job right. His mission had always been clear: clean up the force, root out dirty cops, and rebuild trust between the department and the people. But nothing could have prepared him for the phone call that would turn his job into something deeply personal. His phone vibrated on the desk. When he saw the name on the screen, Dad, his chest tightened. Walter Harris was a proud man, the kind of father who never asked for help. If he was calling, something was wrong. Daniel answered immediately. "Dad, you okay?" There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a slow, heavy sigh. "No, son, I'm not." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "What happened?" Walter's voice was steady, but Daniel could hear the quiet rage underneath. He listened as his father described every painful detail, how officers Randall Green and David Myers had pulled him over, humiliated him, stolen his hard-earned money, and driven off as if nothing had happened. With every word, Daniel's breathing grew heavier. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. When his father finished, silence hung between them. Daniel leaned forward, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk. "They robbed you?" "Yes, son." Daniel exhaled slowly, his knuckles turning white. He had dealt with corruption before. He had fired men for excessive force, reported those who abused their power, and even testified against fellow officers in internal investigations. But this was different. This wasn't just corruption. This wasn't just another case to investigate. This was his father. Daniel's voice was low, controlled, but deadly serious. "I'll handle it." For the first time in his career, Daniel wasn't just thinking like a police captain. He was thinking like a son. Within the hour, he was at the precinct, reviewing Green and Myers' records. Multiple complaints had been filed against them over the years. Excessive force, intimidation, questionable stops, but each case had been buried, dismissed, or conveniently lost. Daniel's blood boiled. These men had terrorized his community for years, and now they had crossed the wrong man. His first call was to Internal Affairs. His second call was to the mayor. His third call was to dispatch. Green and Myers were still on duty, patrolling the city like nothing had happened. That was about to change. Daniel didn't wait for morning. He personally drove to the sector where Green and Myers were stationed. He found them exactly where he expected, leaning against their squad car, laughing and drinking coffee, like 2 men without a care in the world. Daniel pulled up, stepped out, and approached them with the slow, deliberate walk of a man who knew he was in complete control. Green smirked. "Captain Harris, what brings you down here?" Daniel didn't smile. "Where's my father's money?" The question hit like a bullet. The smirk vanished from Green's face. Myers cleared his throat. "Sir, I'm not sure what you mean." Daniel's eyes turned to ice. "Don't lie to me." Green's jaw tightened. "Look, Captain, I think there's been some kind of—" Daniel took a step closer. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You picked the wrong man." Green's nostrils flared, but he didn't speak. Daniel wasn't just their superior, he was their reckoning. "Get in the car," Daniel ordered. Myers hesitated. "Sir, is this really necessary?" Daniel cut him off. "Now." The authority in his voice left no room for argument. They weren't officers anymore. They were suspects. And for the first time in their careers, they had to answer to someone who wasn't afraid of them. As the squad car pulled away, Daniel reached for his radio and spoke one last order. "Bring them in." Tonight, justice wasn't just being served. It was personal. Daniel Harris had spent his entire career fighting men like Green and Myers. He had seen officers like them, those who hid behind the badge, treating their position as a shield for their own corruption. But this time, they had crossed the wrong man. By morning, the trap was already set. It wasn't enough to fire them. No, Daniel wanted them humiliated, exposed, and held accountable in front of the very department they had disgraced. Sitting in his office, Daniel sifted through every complaint, internal report, and disciplinary action Green and Myers had dodged over the years. It was a pattern: intimidation, threats, extortion. They weren't just dirty cops, they were criminals, and Daniel was about to take them down. That afternoon, Daniel summoned Green and Myers to his office. The two men entered with cocky grins, their usual arrogance dripping from their posture. They didn't know. They still thought they were untouchable. Daniel leaned back in his chair, keeping his voice even. "We've had complaints about officers extorting civilians." Green smirked, arms crossed. "You don't say." Daniel studied them closely. They weren't worried. They thought this was just another empty accusation, another report that would get buried under bureaucracy. Not this time. "Good," Daniel said, his expression unreadable. "Because starting today, all patrol officers are required to wear body cams. No exceptions." The shift in their demeanor was instant. Myers stiffened, his jaw clenching. Green's smirk wavered, just slightly. "Got you." "If you've got nothing to hide," Daniel continued, "this shouldn't be a problem." Green forced a laugh. "Of course not, Captain." Daniel didn't blink. That night, Daniel put his plan into motion. A young black officer, Detective Reed, agreed to pose as a civilian. Wearing a hidden wire, he parked an old car in a known patrol zone of Green and Myers, pretending to be a man who had unpaid fines. It took less than 15 minutes for Green and Myers to fall into the trap. "You know, we could make those fines disappear," Green said casually, leaning against the car window. "Yeah?" Reed played along, his voice shaky. "How much?" "Depends." Myers smirked. "How much is your freedom worth?" They were so confident, so sure this was just another night, another easy payday. They had no idea the entire thing was being recorded. The next morning, Daniel personally led the raid. As soon as Green and Myers walked into the precinct, 6 officers surrounded them. "Officers Green and Myers," Daniel announced, "you're under arrest for extortion, abuse of power, and multiple counts of misconduct." Silence fell over the station. Every officer turned, watching as their own were cuffed. Green's smirk vanished. Myers paled. "Captain, wait. This is a mistake," Myers stammered. Daniel stepped forward, his voice like cold steel. "Number you made the mistake. You robbed an innocent man. You robbed my father, and now you're going to pay for it." As they were led away, officers whispered in hushed voices. For the first time, Green and Myers weren't the ones in control. They were the criminals, and justice was finally coming for them. But Daniel wasn't done yet, because there was still one more thing left to do. Make sure his father saw the men who had stolen from him brought to justice. The courtroom was packed. News of Officers Green and Myers' arrest had spread like wildfire, and today, the city was watching. For years, these two had terrorized the black community. shaking down hard-working people, threatening them, robbing them under the guise of law enforcement. But today, they weren't in uniform. Today, they were the ones in cuffs. Walter Harris sat in the second row, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His broken pride from that day, the way Green had laughed in his face, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood, still burned inside him. But sitting beside him now was his son, Captain Daniel Harris, the same son who had made sure justice was finally coming. The prosecution laid everything out: the undercover sting, the hidden wire, the testimonies from multiple victims. Green and Myers had extorted thousands over the years, preying on those they thought wouldn't fight back. Their defense crumbled. One by one, victims came forward. A single mother, voice shaking, recalled how they took her last $50 when she was late paying rent. An elderly man, eyes filled with rage, recounted how they stopped him every month, always demanding more. And then Walter stood. The room fell silent as he walked slowly to the witness stand, his cane tapping against the polished floor. He looked directly at Green and Myers, who sat stiffly beside their lawyers, their once arrogant faces now pale. Walter inhaled deeply before speaking. "I've lived in this city longer than both of you have been alive. I've worked hard every day of my life. I served my country, and still, you looked at me like I was nothing." The judge nodded for him to continue. "You thought I'd be too afraid to fight back. You thought I had nobody." Walter turned, glancing at Daniel. His son met his gaze, unwavering. "But you were wrong." When the jury returned, the verdict was swift. Guilty on all counts. A gasp spread through the courtroom. Green's jaw clenched. For the first time, he was the one trapped. Myers sank lower into his chair, his once smug confidence shattered. The judge didn't hesitate. Both men were sentenced to prison. The moment the gavel struck, a wave of relief washed over the crowd. People murmured in approval, some clapping softly, others wiping away tears. The weight of injustice, carried for so long, had finally been lifted. As they were led away, Green turned, locking eyes with Daniel. His voice was low, almost desperate. "Harris, you set us up." Daniel didn't flinch. "No, Green, you set yourself up." Later that day, Walter and Daniel walked together down the same street where the robbery had taken place. But this time, everything felt different. People stopped Walter to shake his hand. They thanked Daniel for standing up for them. The fear that had once followed the presence of a patrol car was replaced with something new: hope. Walter paused in front of the bank where it had all started. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, no longer afraid, no longer silent. And then he turned to his son, his boy, the police captain. "You did good, son." His voice was thick with emotion. Daniel exhaled, his grip tightening on his father's shoulder. "I told you, Dad. Nobody messes with my family." For the first time in years, Walter walked through his neighborhood with his head held high. And for the first time in decades, the people of his city knew they had a protector who truly stood for them. Justice had been served. And this time, it was real.